Welcome to our deep dive into the work of Andy Clark. He's this philosopher whose ideas have really changed how we think about the mind. We've got all sorts of stuff to go through, neuroscience papers, philosophical articles, even some background from Wikipedia. And we're going to try and distill it all down for you. Today we're tackling his most famous idea, the extended mind hypothesis. Buckle up, because this one says our minds aren't just stuck in our brains, they actually reach out into the world through tools and tech, maybe even other people.
It's a really fascinating idea, isn't it? It really makes you question where the self ends and the world begins.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we get to the mind-blowing stuff, who asked Andy Clark?
Well, he's a pretty prominent figure in the world of philosophy these days. Currently, he's a professor at the University of Edinburgh. And what's really interesting about his work is how it sits right at the intersection of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience.
So he's not just,
No.
an armchair philosopher.
Yeah.
He's actually looking at how the brain works, too.
Right. Exactly. He's bringing together all these different fields to try and create this new understanding of the mind.
All right, let's get to the main event, the extended mind hypothesis. Can you give us a real-world example of what this actually means?
Imagine you have a friend with Alzheimer's, and they keep a notebook to jot down important information, memories, things like that. Is that notebook just a tool, or has it become something more? Has it become a part of their cognitive system?
It's almost like an external hard drive for their brain.
Yeah, and Clark, along with another philosopher, David Chalmers, they wrote this really influential paper called The Extended Mind. And they actually use an example of a guy named Otto, who has Alzheimer's, to really illustrate this point. Otto's notebook is so crucial to his daily life that it effectively becomes like an external part of his memory.
So it's like the notebook is like an extension of his mind almost, helping him remember things just like his brain would.
Exactly. And this is where the parity principle comes in. This principle basically means that if something outside of our brain, if it consistently and reliably works just like a part of our brain would, then we should consider it a part of our extended mind.
But wouldn't that mean my smartphone is part of my mind too? I mean, I use it for everything.
That's one of the big questions, isn't it? Where do we draw the line? Some critics argue that this idea kind of overextends the definition of the mind. Clark acknowledges this. He says not every tool we use is part of our mind. There needs to be a really tight integration, a deep and consistent connection between the tool and our mental processes.
So what does this all actually mean for us, in our daily lives?
Ideas, they really push us to rethink what the mind really is, especially in our tech-saturated world. I mean, with the internet, we're constantly tapping into information and tools beyond our own brains. So could it be that our minds are stretching further than ever before?
That's a pretty wild thought.
It is. And to really understand Clark's view, we need to look at two other big ideas that go hand in hand with this extended mind hypothesis: embodied cognition and predictive processing.
Okay, let's tackle those one at a time. What's embodied cognition all about?
Embodied cognition emphasizes the role our bodies play in shaping how we think. Could you really understand an abstract idea like love or justice without having a body that actually experiences emotions and interacts with the world?
I see what you mean. It's like our bodies give those abstract ideas meaning because we experience them physically.
Exactly. And while Clark is best known for the extended mind hypothesis, his work has been really influential in developing this broader idea of embodied cognition. He sees the mind as completely intertwined with the body and its experiences in the world.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how about predictive processing? This one sounds a bit more complex.
Think of it this way. Your brain is constantly making predictions about the world based on what it already knows. It builds these internal models, and then it updates those models based on what your senses are telling it.
So my brain's like little scientist constantly running experiments and making hypotheses.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Let's say you're catching a ball. Your brain is predicting where that ball is going to be, which allows you to move your hand to the right spot to catch it. But when that prediction is wrong, that's when you get what's called a prediction error.
Like when I miss the ball completely and it hits me in the face.
Exactly. That prediction error helps your brain refine its internal models so you're more prepared next time. Clark suggests that this whole predictive processing thing, it actually supports the extended mind hypothesis. By extending our predictive abilities into the world, we can use tools and technology to reduce those prediction errors, making us even better at just about everything. Think about using GPS in your car. It's basically extending your sense of direction, helping you predict the best route and avoid getting lost.
So by using tools, we're actually fine-tuning our brain's predictions and making them more accurate.
Which leads us to another fascinating aspect of Clark's work:
Wait, before we move on, I have to ask about consciousness. Where does that fit in with all these ideas about extended minds and predictive brains? How do we explain our subjective experiences?
Philosophers and neuroscientists are still trying to figure out what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Not exactly, but his work offers some really interesting insights. He suggests that consciousness might emerge from a particular kind of generative entanglement between the internal models in our brains and the world around us.
Generative entanglement.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds pretty intense.
It is. It means our brains and the world are constantly shaping each other, like a dance where each move influences the next. And to understand it better, we need to take a closer look at how Clark sees the brain as hierarchy of prediction engines.
Bring on the prediction engines.
Picture your brain as this kind of pyramid. It's made up of all these prediction engines, and each level is making predictions about the level below it. At the very bottom, you have your senses, like what you see, hear, smell, and so on. And the next level up is making predictions about those sensations.
So it's like my brain is organized in layers, with basic sensory information at the bottom and more complex predictions at the top.
And each level is always comparing its predictions to the actual information that it's getting from the level below it. And when there's a mismatch, that's what we call a prediction error, and it gets sent back up the hierarchy.
So those prediction errors are basically like feedback signals, telling the higher levels to adjust their models.
Precisely. This is happening all the time, across all these different levels in your brain. It's how you make sense of the world, maybe even how you become conscious.
So this constant back and forth between our brains and the world, driven by those prediction errors, is what Clark means by generative entanglement.
You got it. And Clark's big point is that this entanglement isn't limited to what's going on inside your skull. It extends outward, including the tools we use, the technology we interact with, even other people.
So my smartphone, my GPS, even that trusty notebook we talked about, they all become part of this generative entanglement, helping my brain make better predictions and avoid those prediction errors.
Exactly. They're all part of what Clark calls the looping effect. Our minds create tools and technologies, but then those tools and technologies loop back and actually change how our minds work. It's a kind of mind-expanding feedback loop.
And I bet that looping effect is only going to get more intense as technology keeps advancing. What does Clark think about things like AI and virtual reality?
Well, Clark's work is really helpful for thinking about a future where those lines between our minds and technology get blurry. He's not afraid to explore those big, mind-bending questions.
This brings us back to something we talked about earlier, the whole idea of the self. If our minds are extending outward into the world, into our tools and tech, does our sense of self also extend outward?
That's a big question that's at the heart of Clark's work. He argues that our sense of self isn't this fixed, unchanging thing, but rather a fluid, dynamic process that's constantly being shaped by our interactions with the world. And that includes our interactions with technology.
So like who we are is constantly being shaped and reshaped by the tools we use and the environments we're in.
Exactly. This has huge implications for how we think about our own agency and responsibility in a world that's increasingly mediated by technology.
It's almost like, are we becoming more than just biological beings? Are we on our way to merging with technology and creating some kind of hybrid mind?
Well, those are fascinating questions, and Clark encourages us to grapple with them. He doesn't necessarily offer any easy answers, but his work gives us a really insightful framework for thinking about these complex issues.
Okay, so I'm feeling a little dizzy with all these existential questions. Before we go too far down the rabbit hole, let's talk about some of the criticisms of the extended mind hypothesis. Like, what are some of the main objections people have raised?
Well, one common criticism is that it blurs the lines between what's really cognitive, what's happening in our brains, and what's simply a tool or something in our environment. So critics say that just because you use a tool regularly, even if you rely on it, doesn't automatically make it part of your mind.
It's kind of like saying my car is part of my transportation system, because I use it all the time to get around. It's a tool, but it's not literally part of my body.
Yeah, that's the argument. They say we need to be clear about the difference between what's happening inside our brains and the external things we use to help those processes along.
So where do Clark and Chalmers draw the line? Like, how do they distinguish between a tool that's just a tool and one that's become so integrated it's part of this extended mind?
Well, they've come up with a few criteria. First, the tool has to be consistently and reliably available. It can't be something you use just once in a while. Second, it has to be deeply integrated into your mental processes. It's not just a passive thing. It has to be actively involved in shaping how you think and act.
So it's not just about how often I use a tool, but how deeply it's woven into the way I think and function.
Right. And third, the material has to be readily accessible, meaning you don't have to go through a bunch of steps to get information from it. It should be as easy to access as a memory or a fact that you can pull from your own brain.
So my smartphone, which is always with me and I use for everything,
Yeah.
navigation, communication,
Mm-hmm.
even like storing memories, that's more likely to be considered part of my extended mind than, say, a library book I borrow occasionally.
That's a great example. Your smartphone, because it's constantly available and such a big part of your daily life, really fits that kind of coupled system that Clark and Chalmers are talking about.
Okay, so we've got these criteria for what makes an extended mind. But that question of boundaries still feels a little fuzzy to me. Like, if my smart zone is part of my mind, where does my mind end and the smartphone begin? And what about the internet, which my smartphone connects to? Does that become part of my extended mind too?
Those are the tough questions. That's one of the biggest challenges with this extended mind hypothesis. How do we define the edges of the self when our minds could be stretching out into this vast network of tools, technology, information?
It's almost like our minds are becoming these huge interconnected ecosystems,
Mm.
constantly interacting with and being shaped by everything around it.
And this raises all sorts of philosophical questions about who we are, what we're capable of, and what we're responsible for. If our minds are so intertwined with the world, where does the individual self even begin and end?
And if my actions are being influenced by this network of extended resources, who's really in control? Me or my tech?
These are the questions that Clark wants us to wrestle with. He sees them as crucial for understanding what it means to be human in an age of increasingly powerful and pervasive technology.
So Clark isn't just trying to explain how the mind works. He's trying to figure out what it means to be human in this rapidly changing technological landscape.
Exactly. He's challenging us to think beyond traditional ideas about the self and to embrace a more expansive, dynamic view of what it means to think and act in the world.
My mind is definitely feeling expanded right now. But before we get too lost in the philosophical weeds, I want to get back to the science behind Clark's ideas. He talks a lot about predictive processing as a key mechanism behind the extended mind. Can you break down exactly how predictive processing works in the brain?
Of course. Remember, predictive processing suggests that our brains are constantly generating and updating these internal models of the world in order to predict what our senses are going to encounter next. It's like our brains are constantly running these simulations.
And these predictions aren't just about the external world, are they? They also involve our own bodies and actions.
Absolutely. Predictive processing models really emphasize the close relationship between how we perceive things, how we act, and how we think. Our brains aren't just trying to predict what we're going to see, hear, and feel, but also how our own bodies will move and react in different situations.
So it's like my brain is a choreographer, anticipating the next step in the dance between my body and the world.
That's a great way to put it. When those predictions are accurate, everything feels smooth and effortless. But when there's a mismatch between what we predict and what our senses tell us, we get that prediction error.
Like when I trip over a crack in the sidewalk because my brain didn't predict that little bump in the terrain.
Exactly. Those prediction errors are really important because they tell the brain that its internal model needs to be adjusted.
So it's this constant loop. The brain makes a prediction, compares it to sensory data, tweaks its models based on any errors, and then uses those updated models to make better predictions in the future.
You got it. And this process is happening all over the brain, from basic sensory processing to more complex functions like making decisions and planning.
Now I'm starting to see how this whole predictive processing idea could support the extended mind hypothesis. If our brains are always trying to minimize those prediction errors, it makes sense that we would try to offload some of that predictive work onto external tools and resources.
Exactly. By extending our predictive abilities out into the world, we can kind of lighten the load on our brains and become more efficient and adaptable, especially in complex situations.
It's almost like we're outsourcing some of our brain power to the cloud.
You could say that. And Clark's point is that this kind of cognitive offloading isn't anything new. Humans have been extending their minds into the world for a very long time, using tools and technology to boost our cognitive abilities.
Right, from the earliest stone tools to the printing press to the internet, we've always been coming up with new ways to augment our brain power.
Clark sees this as a natural and even an essential part of human evolution. We're not just creatures with brains. We're creatures who have evolved to extend those brains outward into the world.
This has been a fascinating journey so far. We've explored the extended mind hypothesis, embodied cognition, predictive processing, the looting effect, even the boundaries of the self. What I'm wondering now is, what are some practical applications of Clark's work? Like, how can we actually use these ideas in our daily lives?
Well, one practical takeaway is to become more aware of how the tools and technologies we use are actually shaping our minds and our behaviors. Instead of thinking of technology as separate from ourselves, we can start to see it as an extension of our own cognitive processes.
So it's like being more mindful of the feedback loops between our minds and our tech, recognizing that they're constantly influencing each other.
And this awareness can help us make more informed decisions about which technologies we use and how we use them.
So instead of letting our smartphones control us, we can try to be more intentional about how we use them to enhance our cognitive abilities, rather than letting them take over our lives.
Clark's work also has implications for education. If we acknowledge that learning isn't confined to what happens inside our skulls, we can design learning environments that encourage students to extend their minds outward, using tools, technology, and collaboration to learn more effectively.
Yeah, it's like shifting away from that old model of passively absorbing information and moving towards a more active, engaged approach to learning, where exploration and creation are key.
Right. And Clark's work can also change how we think about mental health and well-being. If our minds are so deeply intertwined with our environments and the technology we use, it makes sense that those things can have a huge impact on how we feel mentally.
So like a cluttered and chaotic environment might make us feel overwhelmed, while a calm and organized environment could help us feel more clear-headed and focused.
And in the same way, technologies designed to be addictive and attention-grabbing could contribute to anxiety and distraction, while technologies designed to be mindful and empowering might contribute to our well-being and sense of agency.
It all goes back to that idea of being in control of our technology and using it in ways that support our mental health rather than undermining it.
Clark's work gives us a framework for thinking about these things in a more nuanced and holistic way. It's not about demonizing technology, but about understanding how profoundly it can influence us and making conscious choices about how we want to integrate it into our lives.
Okay, we've covered so much ground here, from the philosophy behind the extended mind hypothesis to the practical applications for learning, mental health, and our relationship with technology. But there's one big piece of Clark's work we haven't fully explored yet. What do his ideas mean for our understanding of consciousness?
While Clark's ideas about the extended mind hypothesis and embodied cognition have gotten a lot of attention, his more recent work on consciousness has sparked even more debate.
I'm ready to dive into the deep end of the consciousness pool.
Yeah.
What are some of Clark's key ideas about how consciousness might work? And how do those ideas connect to his other work on the extended mind and predictive processing?
Well, one of Clark's main points about consciousness is that it's not something that happens in a separate, special part of the brain. Instead, he sees it as emerging from the complex interplay of predictive processing, embodied cognition, and the extended mind.
So instead of searching for a consciousness module in the brain, we should be focusing on the dynamic interactions between the brain, the body, and the world.
Clark argues that consciousness arises from a specific kind of generative entanglement between the predictive models in our brains and the world around us. This entanglement involves this constant back and forth flow of predictions, prediction errors, and adjustments, and it shapes both our perception of the world and our sense of self.
It's like consciousness is this dance between the brain and the world, a dance that's constantly evolving and adapting based on the feedback loops between predictions and prediction errors.
And Clark emphasizes that this dance isn't just happening within the skull. It extends outward, encompassing our tools, technologies, and even other people.
So my smartphone, my GPS, my trusty notebook, are you saying they're all becoming part of that dance of consciousness, helping my brain make sense of the world and shape my subjective experience?
Clark argues that this isn't some new phenomenon. Humans have been extending their minds and their consciousness outward into the world for millennia, using tools and technologies to handle some of the cognitive load and to open up new possibilities for experience.
It's like we're constantly expanding the stage on which the dance of consciousness is performed, creating new roles and relationships between the brain, the body, and the world.
And this idea has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe. If consciousness isn't confined to the brain, but rather emerges from this dynamic interplay between the brain, the body, and the world, then it challenges our traditional notions of individual identity, agency, and responsibility.
It makes you wonder, if our minds and our consciousness are so deeply intertwined with the world, where does the individual self begin and end? And if our actions are being influenced by this network of extended cognitive resources, who's really in control?
These are questions that Clark doesn't shy away from. In fact, he sees them as central to understanding what it means to be human. in an age of increasingly powerful and ubiquitous technology.
So Clark's work isn't just about understanding the mind. It's about understanding ourselves and our place in a rapidly evolving technological landscape.
He's challenging us to think beyond the traditional boundaries of the self and to embrace a more expansive and dynamic view of what it means to be a cognitive agent in the world.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling my mind expanding here, but before we get too carried away with those grand philosophical questions, let's ground ourselves in some of the scientific evidence that Clark draws on to support his ideas about consciousness. He often talks about the importance of what he calls self-predicting loops in the brain. Can you explain what those are and how they might relate to consciousness?
Self-predicting loops, as Clark describes them, are basically feedback loops within the brain. Where one area is making predictions about the activity of another area, these loops are thought to be crucial for integrating information from different parts of the brain and creating this unified sense of self.
So it's like different parts of the brain are having a conversation with each other, constantly predicting and anticipating what the other parts are going to do.
And Clark argues that these self-predicting loops aren't just about integrating information, they're also about generating our subjective experience. He suggests that consciousness might arise from the specific kinds of self-predicting loops that involve the brain's internal models of the body and the self.
So it's like my brain is not just predicting what's going to happen in the world, it's also predicting what it's like to be me in the world, experiencing those events from my own unique perspective.
And Clark argues that these self-related predictions aren't just passive representations. They actually actively shape our experience. They influence how we feel, what we attend to, and how we make decisions.
It's like our sense of self isn't just a byproduct of our brain activity. It's an active participant in shaping that activity, influencing the very flow of consciousness.
And Clark sees these self-predicting loops as deeply intertwined with the extended mind. He argues that our tools and technologies can become part of these loops, extending our self-related predictions outward into the world.
So my smartphone, my GPS, my trusty notebook, they're all becoming part of those self-predicting loops, shaping my sense of self and my experience of the world.
And this is where things get really interesting. If our sense of self is being shaped by our interactions with the world, including our interactions with technology, then it raises some really profound questions about the nature of identity, agency and responsibility in an increasingly technologically mediated world.
It makes you wonder, are we becoming more than just biological beings? Are we merging with our technologies to create a new kind of hybrid mind? A mind that's both embodied and extended, both biological and technological?
That's a fascinating question, and it's one that Clark encourages us to explore. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but his work provides a framework for thinking about these complex issues in a really nuanced and insightful way.
Okay, we've covered a lot of mind-bending territory here, but before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more aspect of Clark's work that I find particularly intriguing: his engagement with the idea of generative models. Can you explain what generative models are? And how they fit into Clark's overall framework?
Generative models are essentially internal models that the brain uses to simulate and predict the world, including the brain's own sensory inputs and actions. They're like internal representations of how the world works, capturing the statistical regularities and causal relationships between different events.
So it's like my brain is this little statistician, constantly gathering data and building models to predict what's going to happen next.
That's a good way to think about it. And Clark argues that these generative models aren't just passive representations. They actively shape our experience, influencing how we perceive the world, how we make decisions, and even how we feel.
So it's like our internal models aren't just reflecting the world, they're actively constructing our reality.
Precisely. And this is where things get really interesting. If our experience is being shaped by our internal models, and those models are constantly being updated based on our interactions with the world, then it suggests that our reality isn't this fixed and objective thing, but rather fluid and subjective, constantly being shaped by our own minds.
Whoa, that's a pretty radical idea. It's like saying that we're not just passive observers of the world, we're active participants in creating our own reality.
Exactly. And Clark argues that this isn't a new idea. Philosophers and scientists have been grappling with the nature of reality and the role of the mind in shaping our experience for centuries. But Clark's work brings these ideas into the 21st century, grounding them in the latest findings from neuroscience, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence.
This is all incredibly fascinating. I'm definitely going to need some time to process all of this.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in. Maybe we should pick this up in part 3.
Sounds like a plan. We'll see you there for the final part of our deep dive into the mind of Andy Clark. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the world of Andy Clark. I'm still processing all those incredible ideas about the extended mind and predictive brains and the mind-bending concept of generative entanglement.
It really challenges us to rethink, the traditional boundaries
Yeah.
of what we consider mind, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And speaking of boundaries, I'm curious about how Clark's ideas apply to our interactions with other people. Like if our minds can extend outwards into our smartphones and notebooks, can they also extend into other minds?
That's a great question, and one that Clark has definitely addressed in his work. He argues that our social interactions can actually be seen as a form of cognitive extension, where we're essentially offloading cognitive work onto others, just as we offload it onto our tools and technologies.
Oh, so like when I ask a friend for directions, instead of trying to figure out the map myself, I'm basically using their spatial reasoning skills to supplement my own.
Exactly. And this happens all the time in our social lives. We rely on others for information, for emotional support, help with decisions even to help us shape our own sense of who we are.
Think about how our beliefs and values are often shaped by the people we spend time with. It's almost like our minds are constantly interacting and influencing each other, creating a kind of collective intelligence.
And Clark argues that this collective intelligence isn't just a metaphor, it's a real phenomenon that's supported by the principles of predictive processing and the extended mind.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. Our brains are always making predictions, including predictions about how other people will behave. And when we interact, we're sharing information and updating our internal models, creating this kind of shared reality.
And this shared reality isn't just about facts and information. It also encompasses emotions, values, even our sense of self. We're constantly shaping and reshaping our realities together through our interactions.
It's like we're weaving this tapestry of shared meaning. It's constantly evolving and expanding as we connect with others.
What a beautiful way to put it. This idea of a shared tapestry of meaning. It has profound implications for how we understand social life culture and what it means to be human.
It really highlights how interconnected we are, constantly shaping and being shaped by the minds around us.
And this interconnectedness isn't just a nice idea, it's a fundamental aspect of how our minds work, as Clark's work so clearly shows.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Andy Clark's work, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think Clark is really urging us to think beyond the traditional limitations of what we consider mind, to recognize that our minds don't stop at the edges of our brains, but extend outward into the world through our tools, our technologies, our relationships. And by embracing this more expansive view, we can become more aware of how these external elements are shaping our thoughts, our emotions, our actions.
It's like we're being invited to take a step back and recognize the incredible interconnectedness of our minds and the world around us.
And in doing so, we open ourselves up to new possibilities for understanding ourselves, our relationships, and the ever-evolving world we inhabit.
Well, it's definitely been a mind-expanding journey. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through the intricacies of Andy Clark's work. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has left you with a renewed sense of wonder about the incredible potential of your own extended mind.